I watched my husband walk past me without even turning his head. His hand rested on the lower back of another woman, casual and intimate, like it belonged there. The gesture landed harder than any scream could have. I counted the seconds between his laugh and hers, the way their shoulders leaned together, the confidence in his stride as they moved toward first class. Row 1. Seats A and B. I stayed where I was. Seat 6, Economy Plus, my boarding pass folded neatly in my palm. I took a slow breath and let the hum of the aircraft wash over me. The irony tasted sharp. 3 weeks earlier, he'd stood in our kitchen and told me New York was a mandatory solo conference. No spouses, no distractions. "Just work," he'd said, kissing my forehead like a favor. Funny how work required 2 first-class tickets and a hotel overlooking Central Park. Funnier still that the man settling into the seat beside me, adjusting his cufflinks with deliberate calm, was my husband's boss. He followed my gaze, eyes narrowing just enough to confirm what he already knew. He didn't ask a question. He didn't need to. At 37,000 feet, somewhere between trust and free fall, I realized this wasn't going to end with tears or apologies. This was going to end with consequences. My name is Evelyn Hart, and until that moment I thought betrayal was the worst thing that could happen in a marriage. I was wrong. I had built my life on order. I liked schedules, color-coded calendars, knowing where everything belonged. I worked as a compliance director for a mid-sized investment firm in Connecticut, the kind of job that taught you how quickly small lies turned into big disasters. My days were filled with policies and procedures, quiet power and careful documentation. At home, I was the steady one. The planner, the woman who remembered birthdays and dentist appointments, and the exact brand of cereal our son refused to eat if the box looked different. My husband, Daniel Hart, thrived on charm. 42, tall, effortlessly likable, a senior regional manager for a pharmaceutical company that loved the way he could sell ice to January. People trusted him. They believed him. I had believed him for 12 years. From the outside, we looked like the kind of couple people pointed to as proof that marriage still worked. Suburban house with a maple tree out front. One child, Noah, 8 years old, bright and endlessly curious. Weekend soccer games, summer barbecues, holiday cards with forced smiles that eventually became real. Until they didn't. The cracks had been there longer than I wanted to admit. Late nights that didn't quite add up. Phone calls taken in the garage. A sudden interest in new suits and expensive cologne he claimed was a free sample. I told myself it was ambition. Promotions changed people. Pressure changed people. Marriage required patience. That's what I told myself when he stopped asking about my day and started answering texts at the dinner table. That's what I told myself when he booked a solo conference on the week of our anniversary and didn't even pretend to feel guilty. The woman with him now fit the part he'd chosen for her. Polished, confident, the kind of beauty that looked practiced rather than effortless. She wore cream-colored heels and carried herself like she'd already won. I wondered briefly what story he'd sold her. Separated, unhappy, trapped by routine. Men like Daniel always had a narrative ready. Beside me, his boss shifted, crossing his legs with measured ease. Richard Cole had a reputation for being unflinching. Late 50s, silver hair, eyes that missed nothing. He'd once fired a senior executive during a company retreat without raising his voice or spilling his coffee. I'd met him twice at corporate events, exchanged pleasantries, nothing more. Now he was inches away, watching the same lie unfold in real time. Neither of us spoke as the plane began to fill. The overhead bins slammed shut. The flight attendant smiled and offered pre-departure drinks. I declined. I needed my head clear. I needed to remember every detail, every movement, every choice that led us here. When the engines roared to life, I felt something settle inside me. Not rage, not despair, clarity. I understood then that whatever Daniel thought he was flying toward in New York, he wasn't arriving alone. He just didn't know it yet. I didn't look at him again once the plane leveled off. I didn't need to. I already had the picture burned into my mind. Daniel's hand at her back, his easy confidence, the lie walking 2 rows ahead of me like it owned the place. Instead, I focused on my breathing, slow and even, the way my therapist had once taught me during a particularly brutal audit season. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Control what you can. Document the rest. The seatbelt sign clicked off, and the cabin relaxed into that strange in-between state where time stretches and reality feels suspended. Around me, people settled in for the flight. Laptops opened. Headphones went on. A woman across the aisle pulled out a neck pillow and closed her eyes as if nothing in the world could possibly be wrong. I almost envied her. Out of the corner of my eye, I felt the man beside me shift again. Richard Cole didn't fidget like nervous people did. His movements were deliberate, economical. He glanced forward once more, long enough to confirm what we both knew, then turned his attention back to the tablet in his lap. No questions, no awkward sympathy, just silence, the kind that weighed more than words. I wondered if he remembered me, if he knew my name. I'd been introduced as Daniel's wife at a holiday party years ago, handed a glass of wine, complimented on my dress. Back then, I'd smiled and played the part, unaware of how easily women were reduced to footnotes in other people's stories. Sitting there now, I felt the irony settle deep in my chest. The flight attendants moved through the aisle, offering drinks. I accepted a sparkling water this time, the cold condensation grounding me. As I lifted the cup, my hand didn't shake. That surprised me. I'd always assumed that if I ever caught my husband cheating, I'd fall apart. Tears, rage. A scene so dramatic it would make strangers uncomfortable. Instead, I felt eerily steady, like I'd stepped into a role I hadn't known I'd been rehearsing for years. Daniel had always underestimated stillness. He mistook calm for weakness, silence for ignorance. It was one of the reasons he'd gotten so good at lying. He assumed no one was paying close enough attention to catch him. He was wrong. As the plane crossed over the Atlantic darkness, my thoughts drifted backward, not in nostalgia but in inventory. The first red flag had appeared almost a year ago, a canceled dinner, then another. The way he'd started guarding his phone like it contained state secrets, the gym membership he suddenly needed, even though he'd never liked working out. I'd noticed it all, filed it away, told myself it was stress, career pressure, a phase. That was the lie I'd told myself. What Daniel didn't know was that I'd grown up watching secrets rot families from the inside out. My mother had stayed too long with a man who learned early that apologies worked just well enough to reset the clock. She'd taught me, without meaning to, exactly what not to do. Still, love has a way of dulling even the sharpest lessons, until it doesn't. I glanced down at my phone, not to check messages, but to confirm what I already knew. Screenshots saved, dates logged, accounts traced. I hadn't confronted him when I first suspected the truth. I hadn't needed to. Confrontation was emotional. Documentation was permanent. Ahead of me, I caught a glimpse of movement as a flight attendant leaned into first class. I imagined Daniel laughing softly, already playing the role of devoted companion. I wondered if the woman beside him knew she was sitting in the middle of a marriage she didn't fully understand, or if she did know and simply didn't care. Either way, it wasn't her choices that mattered most to me. It was his. Richard shifted again, closing his tablet. He looked straight ahead, then finally turned to me. His expression was neutral, professional, but his eyes were sharp. "Long flight," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied, "it is." Nothing more passed between us, but something unspoken settled into place. He wasn't making conversation. He was acknowledging presence, awareness. The fact that two people in this row understood far more than the people sipping champagne in the rows ahead. I wondered what calculations were happening behind his eyes. Expense reports, company policies, the risk of embarrassment versus the certainty of violation. Men like Richard Cole didn't operate on feelings. They operated on consequences. As the cabin lights dimmed, I leaned back and closed my eyes. Not to sleep, but to plan. New York wasn't just a destination. It was a stage. Deals were made there. Careers were built and destroyed quietly, behind glass walls and conference room doors. Daniel thought he was arriving in a city that rewarded ambition and secrecy. What he didn't realize was that I'd already arrived somewhere else entirely. By the time the plane touched down, this wouldn't be about infidelity alone. It would be about power, exposure, and the cost of underestimating the woman who knew you better than anyone else. I opened my eyes as turbulence rattled the cabin, a faint smile touching my lips. He still had no idea what was coming. The flight settled into a steady hum, the kind that lulled most people into sleep. I watched the cabin lights dim, row by row, as if the plane itself were closing its eyes. Somewhere ahead of me, Daniel and the woman were likely doing the same thing together, sharing headphones, whispering plans, pretending the world behind them didn't exist. I didn't look. I didn't need to. I could feel the weight of their presence like a bruise. I shifted in my seat and opened my laptop, more out of habit than necessity. The screen glowed softly, a familiar comfort. Spreadsheets, notes, a folder labeled with a name that still felt strange to type. Documentation had always calmed me. Facts didn't betray you. Numbers didn't lie when you asked the right questions. Beside me, Richard Cole hadn't slept. I could tell by the way he sat, straight-backed, eyes occasionally flicking toward the aisle, then forward again. He was aware of everything, including me, especially me. Silence stretched between us, but it wasn't awkward. It was deliberate. At one point, he spoke without turning his head. "You work in finance, don't you?" I glanced at him, surprised but not startled. "Compliance," I said. "Risk management." He nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something he'd already suspected. "That explains it." "Explains what?" I asked. "Why you're so calm," he replied. His tone wasn't unkind, it was observant. Most people wouldn't be. I let out a quiet breath. Most people don't realize how much damage calm can do. That earned a faint smile, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. He didn't respond, but I could tell I'd said something that mattered. Not emotionally, strategically. As the hours passed, I found myself replaying the last few months not with regret, but with clarity. The late nights that came with rehearsed excuses, the sudden privacy around finances he'd never cared about before. The way he'd stopped using our shared calendar, claiming it was easier to manage things on his own. Each detail clicked into place now, not as a mystery but as a pattern I'd ignored, because I wanted the version of him I'd married to still exist. I thought about the night he told me about the New York conference. We'd been standing in the kitchen, the dishwasher humming in the background. Noah was already asleep, his science project half finished on the dining table. Daniel had leaned against the counter, arms crossed, casual. "It's mandatory," he'd said. "Just a couple of days, in and out." I'd asked if I could come, half joking. He hadn't laughed. "You'd be bored," he'd replied. "Meetings all day, dinners with clients." That was the moment something inside me had gone quiet. Not alarm bells, something colder, something patient. I'd checked his itinerary the next morning while he was in the shower. Not to spy, I'd told myself, just to see how tight his schedule was. The hotel reservation had been vague, the flight unusually expensive. I'd taken screenshots without fully knowing why, my instincts working faster than my heart. Now, sitting at 37,000 feet, I understood exactly why I'd saved them. The woman in front of me shifted in her seat, letting out a soft snore. I envied her ability to disconnect. For me, this flight wasn't about endurance. It was about timing, about letting things unfold far enough that they couldn't be undone. Richard leaned back, folding his hands across his stomach. "Appearances matter," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Yes," I agreed, "they do." "Especially when they contradict expense reports," he added, his voice still low. I turned to him then, meeting his gaze directly. "I imagine they do." That was it. No accusations, no questions, just acknowledgement. The line had been drawn without either of us stepping over it. I realized then that he didn't need me to explain what I knew. He didn't need proof yet. He was already calculating the fallout. And Daniel was still 2 rows ahead, blissfully unaware that the ground beneath him was starting to shift. I closed my laptop and rested my head against the seat, staring at the darkened ceiling. Somewhere over the Atlantic, I felt the last of my hesitation burn away. Whatever love I'd been holding onto had already been replaced by something stronger. Self-respect. Resolve. The quiet confidence that came from knowing you were no longer reacting. You were acting. When the flight attendants announced breakfast service, I realized I'd barely slept. It didn't matter. Adrenaline had taken over, sharp and clean. I accepted the tray without appetite, pushing the food aside. Across the aisle, a man was already packing his bag, eager for arrival. I wondered how many people on this plane were flying toward truths they didn't yet know. How many believed they were in control simply because no one had challenged them yet. Daniel believed that. He believed lies were safe if they were comfortable. He believed silence meant ignorance. As the plane began its slow descent, the city lights of New York flickering faintly in the distance, I allowed myself one final thought before everything changed. By the time he realized I'd been watching all along, it would already be too late. I noticed the shift in him before he said a word. It was subtle, the way his shoulders tightened as we began our descent, the way his attention sharpened instead of relaxing. Most passengers grew restless when landing approached, eager to stand, to reclaim their phones, to re-enter the world. Richard Cole grew quieter, more focused, like a man stepping into a meeting he'd already prepared for. The cabin lights brightened, and the flight attendants made their final rounds. I kept my eyes forward, my posture neutral. 2 rows ahead, Daniel leaned toward the woman, murmuring something that made her smile. He looked relaxed, victorious even, the kind of man who believed the hardest part was already over. I almost felt sorry for him. The plane touched down with a dull thud that traveled up through my spine. Tires screamed briefly against the runway, then steadied. Applause broke out somewhere behind us. I stayed still, hands folded in my lap, heart steady. This wasn't the moment. Not yet. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, phones buzzed back to life, notifications chimed, messages flooded in. I glanced at my screen long enough to confirm what I'd been waiting for. A single email, no subject line, just a name and a time. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. I locked the screen again, slipping the phone back into my bag. Richard stood as soon as the seatbelt sign went off. He didn't look at me this time, just adjusted his jacket, reached for his carry-on, and stepped into the aisle with the ease of someone accustomed to moving first. I stayed seated, watching as first-class passengers filed out ahead of us. Daniel and the woman disappeared into the jet bridge, laughing, her hand hooked casually through his arm. Let him go, I thought, let him believe. When I finally stood, the aisle was crowded with bodies and impatience. I moved slowly, deliberately, letting space build between us. By the time I reached the terminal, they were already far ahead, merging into the stream of arrivals like nothing could touch them. New York greeted us with noise and movement and the sharp smell of coffee and concrete. The city pulsed with its usual indifference, swallowing people whole without asking who they were or what they'd done. I paused just inside the terminal, taking it all in, then turned away from the direction Daniel had gone. My hotel wasn't the one he'd booked. I'd chosen it weeks earlier, quietly, the moment my suspicions hardened into certainty. Different neighborhood, different reservation, my own space. Control had always mattered to me, and I wasn't about to surrender it now. In the back of the taxi, I stared out at the city as it rushed past. Billboards, construction scaffolding, people moving with purpose. This city understood ambition. It also understood consequences. I felt strangely aligned with it, as if New York itself had agreed to keep my secrets for just a little while longer. At the hotel, I checked in under my own name, accepted the key card, and rode the elevator alone. The room was quiet, clean, anonymous. I set my bag down and stood by the window, looking out at the street below. Somewhere in this city, my husband was unpacking with another woman, believing he'd pulled off something clever. I took a breath and let it out slowly. My phone vibrated, a text this time, not from Daniel. Everything is in motion. That was all it said. I didn't respond. Instead, I sat at the small desk and opened my laptop. I reviewed the files I'd already prepared, each one labeled, dated, cross-referenced. Travel receipts, calendar discrepancies, expense reports flagged for review. I hadn't touched his accounts. I hadn't needed to. He'd been careless enough to leave a trail all on his own. People like Daniel always were. I closed the laptop and leaned back in the chair, eyes drifting shut for just a moment. Not to rest, to center myself. This wasn't about punishing him. That was too emotional, too personal. This was about letting the truth surface naturally, the way it always did when given enough time and light. Later that evening, I saw him again by accident. Or maybe not an accident. The hotel lobby was busy, full of conference attendees and tourists. I stepped inside just as the revolving door spun and he walked out, the woman beside him talking animatedly about dinner plans. For a fraction of a second, our eyes met. Recognition flashed across his face, quickly followed by confusion. His step faltered. The woman kept talking, unaware, still smiling. I didn't stop. I didn't speak. I walked past him as if he were a stranger, my gaze steady, my expression unreadable. Behind me, I heard my name. Evelyn? I didn't turn around. By the time I reached the elevator, my hands were trembling, not with fear, but with adrenaline. I pressed the button and watched the doors slide closed, sealing me inside. Tomorrow he would understand what that moment meant. Tonight he was still chasing explanations. I looked at my reflection in the mirrored wall of the elevator and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. She looked older, sharper, like someone who'd finally stopped asking for permission to exist. The city hummed around me, alive and indifferent. And somewhere beneath it all, the walls were starting to talk. I woke before the city did, the gray light just beginning to slip between the buildings outside my window. For a moment I lay still, listening to the muted sounds of traffic below, the distant siren, the hum of a city that never really slept. My phone was face down on the nightstand. I didn't need to check it to know nothing from Daniel would be there yet. He was still convincing himself that what he'd seen in the lobby meant something else. A coincidence. A misunderstanding. Anything but the truth. I got up, showered, dressed with care. Not for him, for myself. A tailored black dress, understated, professional. The kind of outfit that made people assume you knew exactly where you were going. By the time I left the hotel, the city had fully awakened. All sharp edges and ambition. I blended into it easily. Breakfast was a quiet affair at a small cafe a block from my hotel. I sat alone with my coffee, watching people scroll through their phones, oblivious to the dramas unfolding just beyond their screens. I wondered how many of them were walking around with secrets that hadn't caught up to them yet, how many believed they were still safe. My phone vibrated just as I was finishing my coffee. This time it was Daniel. "Where are you staying? We need to talk." I stared at the screen, considering the words, not apologetic, not confused, just urgent, controlling. I slid the phone back into my bag without replying and paid the check. By the time I reached my hotel again, another message had come through. "I saw you last night. This isn't what you think." That one almost made me laugh. Up in my room, I sat at the desk and opened my laptop. Today wasn't about emotions or explanations. It was about alignment, timing, making sure every piece was exactly where it needed to be before the first domino fell. I sent one email, short and precise, then closed the laptop again. Nothing else needed to be said yet. Late morning crept toward noon. Somewhere across the city, Daniel was likely pacing, replaying our brief eye contact in the lobby, trying to figure out how much I knew. He'd always hated not being in control. That was his weakness. He needed reactions, tears, anger. Silence unnerved him. I left the hotel again, this time with no particular destination. Walking calmed me, and New York offered endless paths to disappear into. As I crossed a busy intersection, my phone rang. Daniel's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring. Then again. And again. On the fourth attempt, a voicemail appeared. "Evelyn, please," his voice cracked, the charm stripped away just enough to sound human. "We shouldn't do this here. Let's just meet. I can explain everything." I deleted the message without listening to the rest. Around 2 in the afternoon, I saw her for the first time alone. She was standing outside a boutique near Fifth Avenue, phone pressed to her ear, her expression tense. The confident ease I'd seen at the airport was gone. In its place was irritation, maybe even fear. She noticed me just as I was about to pass, recognition dawning slowly. "You," she said, ending her call abruptly. "Yes," I replied, my voice calm. She glanced around as if expecting Daniel to appear and rescue her. "I didn't know," she said quickly. "He told me—" "I know what he told you," I interrupted gently. "Men like him always have a story ready." Her jaw tightened. "Then why are you here?" I met her gaze. "The same reason you are. Because the truth doesn't stay hidden forever." She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. Whatever she'd planned to say, she seemed to realize it wouldn't land. Without another word, she turned and walked away, heels clicking sharply against the pavement. I watched her disappear into the crowd, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. She was already exiting the story, she just didn't know it yet. My phone buzzed again as I walked on. This time it wasn't Daniel. 10 minutes later, I found myself seated in the corner of a quiet hotel lounge, sunlight filtering through tall windows. Richard Cole stood across from me, hands clasped behind his back as he looked out over the city. "I wanted to give you a heads up," he said, finally turning to face me. "There will be questions, formal ones." "I expected that," I replied. He nodded. He put me in a difficult position. "He put himself in one," I said evenly. A pause stretched between us, heavy but respectful. "I won't pretend this is personal," he said, "but misuse of company resources is taken seriously." "I understand," I said, and I did, more than he realized. When he left, I sat there a moment longer, absorbing the weight of what was now inevitable. This was the point where the story shifted, where speculation became action. Daniel could still beg, still deny, still try to charm his way out. But systems didn't respond to charm, they responded to evidence. That evening, I returned to my hotel to find several missed calls and a string of messages waiting. "Please answer, I'm scared, we can fix this." I read them once, then turned the phone off entirely. From my window, the city glowed, restless and alive. Somewhere out there, my husband was realizing that the woman he'd underestimated wasn't just watching anymore. She was moving. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. By the third day in New York, the silence had become louder than any argument we'd ever had. I woke to it, thick and pressing, like the city itself was holding its breath. My phone stayed powered off on the nightstand, untouched. I didn't need to read Daniel's messages to know their shape. Panic always followed the same arc with him. Confusion first, then bargaining, then the promise of change he never intended to keep. I dressed and left the hotel early, moving through the morning crowds with purpose. There was something clarifying about anonymity, about being just another woman with a destination and a coffee in hand. It reminded me that my identity had never been limited to being someone's wife. I'd simply let that role take up more space than it deserved. At a quiet cafe near Bryant Park, I opened my laptop and connected to the secure network I'd arranged before the trip. The documents loaded quickly, clean, organized, irrefutable. I reviewed them once more, not because I doubted their strength, but because precision mattered, every timestamp, every discrepancy. The trail Daniel had left behind was thorough in the way only carelessness could produce. I sent one message, just one. It wasn't to Daniel, it was to a legal contact back home, a woman who understood timing as well as I did. The reply came minutes later. "Understood, proceed when ready." That was it, no sympathy, no commentary, just alignment. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent. I watched a group of tourists take photos near the park entrance, laughing, oblivious to the quiet implosions happening in parallel lives around them. I wondered briefly how many people walked through New York thinking it was a place of reinvention, not realizing how brutally it stripped illusions instead. My phone buzzed to life when I turned it back on an hour later. A flood of notifications poured in all at once. Missed calls, voicemails, messages stacked on top of each other like a digital confession. "Evelyn, please, this is getting out of hand. Richard called me. What did you do?" That one made me pause. I didn't reply. Instead, I slipped the phone back into my bag and stood, leaving a few bills on the table. The air outside was colder now, the sky overcast. It felt appropriate. By early afternoon, the city had shifted. I could feel it in the way conversations around me hummed with urgency, in the way my own thoughts sharpened instead of scattered. This was the moment where waiting stopped being passive and became strategic. I saw Daniel again from a distance, purely by chance. He stood on the steps outside a glass office building, phone pressed to his ear, his posture tense. Gone was the relaxed confidence he'd worn at the airport. His shoulders were tight, his jaw clenched, eyes darting as if he expected the ground to give way beneath him at any second. For the first time since all of this began, I felt nothing when I looked at him. No anger, no sadness, just distance, emotional and physical. I turned away before he could see me. Later that evening, I met Richard Cole again, this time briefly, in a quiet corner of a private lounge. The conversation was short, professional. "There will be a formal review," he said. "Compliance, finance, everything." "I assumed as much," I replied. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "I won't ask how you knew what you knew. It's not my place." "No," I agreed, "it isn't." He hesitated, then added, "I'm sorry this involves you." I considered that. "It always did," I said. "I just stopped pretending it didn't." When he left, I stayed behind, staring out at the city lights as they flickered on one by one. This wasn't triumph. It wasn't even revenge in the way people like to imagine it. There was no rush, no thrill, just inevitability. Systems correcting themselves. Truth reclaiming space. Back in my hotel room, I finally listened to one of Daniel's voicemails. His voice sounded smaller than I remembered. "I don't know what's happening," he said. "They're asking questions, about expenses, about the trip, about us. Please call me, I need to understand." I deleted the message and turned the phone face down again. Understanding wasn't his to have anymore. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the quiet settle. Somewhere along the way, I realized this was the moment I'd crossed fully into something new. There was no going back to denial, no version of this story where I pretended ignorance for the sake of comfort. I thought of our son, of the example I was setting without ever saying a word, of the difference between enduring betrayal and refusing to be shaped by it. Outside, a siren wailed briefly, then faded into the distance. Life went on. It always did. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, formalities, finality. Tonight, all that mattered was this calm, this clarity, this unshakable certainty that choosing myself hadn't destroyed my life. It had saved it. He sat beside me again without asking, the same way he had on the plane, as if proximity itself were a statement. This time it wasn't a narrow aircraft seat, but a leather bench outside a glass-walled conference room high above Midtown. The city stretched out beneath us, sharp and glittering, unaware of the quiet reckoning taking place inside this building. Richard Cole didn't look at me at first. He studied the skyline like a man confirming the weather before a long walk. His presence carried the same weight it had at 37,000 feet. Authority without noise, certainty without display. I realized then that he had been paying attention from the very beginning, long before I ever said a word. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said finally. "I did," I replied, and I meant it. The hallway hummed with low voices and the distant click of heels. Somewhere behind the glass, meetings were already starting, agendas unfolding exactly as planned. Daniel was supposed to be in one of them. Supposed to. The word felt fragile now. Richard shifted, crossing his legs with measured ease. "I've reviewed the preliminary reports," he said. "Travel expenses, timing, discrepancies." I nodded once. "They tend to surface when you look closely." He turned his head then, really looking at me, not with pity, not with judgment, with something closer to assessment. "You never reached out to me," he said. "No," I agreed. "I didn't need to." That seemed to amuse him just slightly. "Most people would." "Most people panic," I said. "I prefer preparation." A silence settled between us. Heavy, but not uncomfortable. This wasn't a conversation about feelings. It never had been. It was about structure, accountability, the quiet machinery that kept institutions upright until someone tried to cheat the system. "I won't pretend this is easy," he said after a moment. He was trusted. I thought of Daniel's easy smile, the way he'd always assumed trust was something you earned once and spent freely. Trust isn't permanent, I said. It's conditional. Richard exhaled slowly, as if conceding a point. There will be a formal meeting this afternoon, he said. He'll be asked to explain. And if he can't? I asked. Richard didn't hesitate. Then consequences will follow. I leaned back, feeling the cool leather against my palms. There it was. Not revenge, not triumph, just inevitability. The thing Daniel had never understood. Across the hall, a door opened and closed. Voices shifted. Time moved forward without waiting for anyone to catch up. I wondered where Daniel was at that exact moment. Checking his phone, rehearsing excuses, still hoping this could be managed with charm and half-truths. He doesn't know you're here, Richard added. I know, I said. Do you want him to? I considered the question carefully. No, I said at last. Not yet. He studied me again, and this time there was no mistaking the respect in his expression. That might be wise. We sat there for another minute, two professionals sharing the same uncomfortable reality from different angles. I wasn't his subordinate, I wasn't his ally either. I was something else entirely. A variable he hadn't planned for, but now had to account for. When he stood smoothing the front of his jacket, I remained seated. You'll be informed, he said, formally. I'll be ready, I replied. He paused, hand on the door handle. For what it's worth, he said. You handled this with restraint. I met his gaze. Restraint isn't mercy, I said quietly. It's control. The door closed behind him, leaving me alone in the hallway. I stayed there for a moment longer, letting the quiet settle. This was the axis point, the place where everything tilted and began to fall into its new configuration. My phone vibrated in my bag. I didn't need to check it to know who it was. I waited until the vibration stopped, then stood and walked toward the elevator. In the mirrored walls, my reflection looked composed, almost serene. I barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked like someone who had finally stepped out of the margins of her own life. When the elevator doors opened onto the lobby, I stepped out into the flow of people without hesitation. Somewhere upstairs, Daniel was about to learn that the story he'd been telling himself no longer applied, that the man sitting next to me on the plane, and now in that hallway, had seen everything he thought was hidden. I moved toward the exit, the city swallowing me whole once again. Whatever happened next would happen without my intervention. The structure was in place. The truth was already moving. And for the first time since all of this began, I felt completely untethered from the outcome. Because the power I'd discovered wasn't in watching him fall. It was in knowing I didn't need to watch at all. The call came while I was standing in line for coffee, the barista calling out names that weren't mine. Daniel's name lit up my screen again, persistent, insistent, like a bruise you kept pressing to see if it still hurt. I stared at it for a long moment, then stepped out of line and answered. Where are you? He asked immediately. No greeting, no apology, just demand. I'm in New York, I said evenly. I know that, he snapped. I mean, where exactly? I've been trying to reach you for days. I know, I said again. There was a pause, sharp and ragged. They're auditing everything, he said. Expenses, travel, accounts I didn't even know were connected. Richard won't return my calls. What did you tell him? I leaned against the window watching pedestrians rush past, insulated in their own urgency. I didn't tell him anything, I said. You did. That's not funny, he said. I'm not joking. His breathing came through the line, uneven. You have no idea what this could do to me, he said. My career, our family. Our family, I repeated quietly. Yes, he said, seizing the word. Us, Noah, everything we built. The mention of our son landed differently than he expected, not as leverage, as confirmation. You built something on lies, I said. That doesn't count as stability. You don't understand, he insisted. That trip, it wasn't supposed to be like this. I closed my eyes, not in pain, but in exhaustion. You took another woman on a first-class flight and told me you were alone, I said. Explain that part. Silence. Then smaller, I made a mistake. You made a series of choices, I corrected. Mistakes are accidental. He exhaled sharply. So what, you're punishing me now? No, I said, I'm stepping out of the way. He didn't understand that. I could hear it in the way he struggled to respond. You can't just destroy everything because you're angry, he said. I'm not angry, I replied. I'm done pretending. The call ended abruptly. I didn't know if he'd hung up or if the connection had dropped. Either way, it felt final. I returned to the counter, ordered my coffee, and took it to a small table by the window. My hands were steady as I lifted the cup. That surprised me less now. I'd crossed the threshold already. There was no going back to bargaining. Later that afternoon, the city shifted again. It always did, like a tide you could feel even if you didn't see it. My phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. Meeting concluded. He's been suspended pending review. I stared at the screen, reading it twice. Not relief, not satisfaction, just confirmation. I thought about Daniel in that moment. Called into a room he'd once commanded with ease, forced to answer questions without charm to shield him. I wondered if he'd thought of me, of the way I'd looked at him in the lobby, calm and distant, like someone already living in a future he couldn't reach. That evening, I walked the city aimlessly, letting the movement burn off the last of my adrenaline. Lights came on, music spilled out of bars. Couples laughed, arms linked, convinced of their own permanence. I passed them like a ghost. At a crosswalk near Times Square, my phone buzzed again, a text from Daniel this time. They suspended me. This has gone too far. I didn't respond. Minutes later, another. Please, I need to see you. I kept walking. The truth was there was nothing left to say. Seeing him now wouldn't give either of us closure. It would only reopen a door I'd already closed. Back in my hotel room, I packed, slowly, deliberately. Not because I was leaving immediately, but because I needed the ritual. The physical act of deciding what came with me and what stayed behind. It felt symbolic, shedding weight I no longer needed to carry. I thought of the woman he'd brought with him, wherever she was now. I hadn't seen her again. I suspected she was already gone, distance her preferred form of damage control. That, too, was telling. As night settled over the city, my phone rang one last time. I watched it until it stopped, then powered it off completely. Tomorrow, lawyers would enter the picture. Conversations would become formal. Words would be chosen carefully, stripped of emotion. The structure I'd set in motion would continue without me needing to push. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the strange lightness that came with letting go of a story you'd been trying to fix for too long. Daniel had believed he could compartmentalize his life, that he could lie in one place and succeed in another without consequence. What he was learning now was simple. Everything connects eventually. And when it does, the truth doesn't need to shout. It just waits. The morning I met with my attorney, the city felt sharper, louder, as if it knew something irreversible was about to be signed into existence. I walked the few blocks to her office without checking my phone, my thoughts steady, my steps measured. This wasn't a sprint. It was the long walk you take when you already know where you're going. Her office sat high above the street, glass and steel in quiet authority. She greeted me with a nod instead of a hug, which I appreciated. We'd known each other for years, professionally adjacent but personally distant. She was someone who understood boundaries, and today, boundaries were everything. "You're sure?" she asked once we were seated, a thin folder placed neatly between us. "I am," I said. My voice didn't waver. She opened the folder, flipping through documents I'd reviewed more times than I could count. Asset outlines, timelines, notes on custody considerations. Everything was factual, unemotional, stripped of narrative. This wasn't about telling my story, it was about securing my future. "You've been methodical," she said. "That helps." "It was necessary," I replied. She glanced up at me. "He's not going to take this quietly." I almost smiled. He never does. We went through the details slowly. What I would request, what I would concede, what lines I would not cross. I thought about Noah, about stability, about the kind of life I wanted him to grow up watching. Not one built on appearances, but one grounded in truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable. When it was over, I signed my name at the bottom of the page with a steady hand. The ink dried quickly, sealing decisions that had been forming long before I ever boarded that plane. Outside, the sky had clouded over, the city dimmed beneath a layer of gray. I welcomed it. Sunshine felt too optimistic for a day like this. Daniel called again as I was leaving the building. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, a text followed. "You can't do this without talking to me." I typed back before I could overthink it. "I already have." The reply came instantly. "You're making a mistake." I stared at the screen, then slipped the phone into my bag without answering. He'd said those words before. Every time I'd stood my ground on something he didn't like. He'd never understood that calling my choices mistakes didn't make them less intentional. That afternoon, I sat alone in a quiet park, watching leaves fall despite it not quite being autumn yet. People passed by, dogs tugged at leashes, children laughed. Life, unbothered by my private unraveling. It struck me then how small my drama really was in the grand scheme of things, and how powerful that realization felt. For the first time, I wasn't the center of a crisis. I was just another person choosing differently. My phone buzzed again, a message from Richard this time. "Formal notice will be issued tomorrow. You won't be mentioned directly, but the findings are substantial." I read it twice, then typed a brief response. "Understood, thank you." That chapter was closing too, quietly, without ceremony. I'd never intended to be part of his professional reckoning. I'd simply refused to protect him from it. By early evening, I returned to my hotel and finished packing. I folded clothes I'd barely worn, placed shoes carefully into their bags, zipped everything shut. Each movement felt deliberate, like I was reclaiming ownership over my time, my space, my decisions. Daniel texted again while I was zipping my suitcase. "Please, just one conversation for Noah." That one gave me pause, not because it worked, but because it confirmed something I'd suspected all along. He still believed access was a right, not a privilege, that invoking our son would reopen doors I'd already closed. I typed slowly. "There will be conversations, just not like this." I turned the phone off after that. As night fell, I stood by the window one last time, looking out at the city that had watched everything unfold without judgment. New York hadn't taken sides. It had simply provided the space for truth to catch up. Tomorrow I would leave, not running, not escaping, just moving forward. Daniel would wake up to official notices, legal language, and the realization that the woman he thought he could manage had already rewritten the terms. I lay down on the bed, fully dressed, and closed my eyes, letting the weight of the day settle into something like peace. This wasn't the end of the story, but it was the end of my silence. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like freedom. The confrontation happened in a place Daniel never expected me to choose. Not a restaurant, not our home, not a lawyer's office. It was a quiet public atrium attached to a museum near Central Park, all glass and stone and echoing footsteps, a place where voices naturally lowered themselves out of respect. Neutral ground, witnesses without an audience. He was already there when I arrived, pacing near a sculpture he wasn't really seeing. His suit looked rumpled, tie loosened, the careful polish gone. When he spotted me, relief flashed across his face so quickly it almost hurt to watch. He stepped toward me like this was a rescue. "Thank God," he said. "I've been trying to get you to talk to me." I didn't stop walking until I reached a bench opposite him. I sat, set my bag down neatly at my feet, and looked up. "I am talking to you." He blinked, thrown off by my calm. "Not like this," he said. "We shouldn't be doing this in public." "That's why I chose it," I replied. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration bleeding through. "Everything is spiraling," he said. "I've been suspended. My accounts are frozen pending review. People are looking at me like I'm guilty of something." "You are," I said simply. He flinched. "You don't know the whole story." I tilted my head. "I know enough." He sat down across from me, leaning forward, lowering his voice. "I made a mistake," he said again, softer this time. "I panicked. Things got complicated. But that doesn't mean you blow up our lives." "Our lives," I echoed. You keep using that phrase as if I wasn't already living in the fallout. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. You could have come to me. We could have handled this privately. I did handle it, I said, just not the way you wanted. His jaw tightened. You went behind my back. I almost laughed. You took another woman on a first-class flight and told me you were alone, I said. Let's not pretend transparency was your priority. Silence fell between us, heavy and exposed. Around us, people moved quietly, unaware of the reckoning unfolding on a bench beneath a skylight. I never meant to hurt you, he said finally. That's not the same as caring whether you did, I replied. That landed. I could see it in his eyes, the sudden realization that charm and intention weren't working anymore. He straightened, his tone shifting, becoming sharper. Defensive. So what now? He asked. You divorce me, take half, ruin my career. Is that the plan? I met his gaze, steady. I didn't ruin your career, I said. Your choices did. I didn't take half. I protected what was already mine. And I didn't do any of this to punish you. Then why? He demanded. I took a breath, feeling the answer settle into place. Because I refuse to model tolerance for betrayal, I said. For myself. For our son. At the mention of Noah, his expression changed. Fear crept in. You're using him against me now? No, I said. I'm protecting him from learning that love means accepting disrespect. He shook his head, standing abruptly. You're overreacting. I stood too, slower, calmer. You're underestimating me, I said. Again. We faced each other then, the space between us filled with everything we hadn't said over the years. The small dismissals, the quiet erasures. The way he'd assumed I would always adapt, always smooth things over, always make it easier for him to succeed. I've already filed, I said. You'll be notified formally. His face drained of color. You did this without telling me. Yes, I said, because telling you would have turned it into a negotiation, and my autonomy isn't negotiable. For a moment he looked like he might argue again. Then his shoulders sagged, the fight leaking out of him. You're really doing this, he said. I already did, I replied. A guard walked past, glancing at us briefly before moving on. The world continued, indifferent. I don't recognize you, Daniel said quietly. I picked up my bag. You never took the time to. I turned to leave, then paused. One more thing, I said, not looking back. This ends today. Any further contact goes through lawyers. If you involve Noah emotionally or try to manipulate him into carrying your guilt, I will respond, decisively. He didn't answer. I walked away without waiting for permission, my footsteps echoing softly against stone. Outside, the air felt cooler, cleaner, like a storm had passed. I didn't feel victorious, I felt complete. Behind me, Daniel remained on that bench, finally understanding that this wasn't a scene he could rewrite. It was the last one we would share. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in waves, measured and procedural, the way systems respond when they finally acknowledge a breach. I was back home when the first official notice landed in my inbox, written in language so neutral it almost felt merciful. Almost. Daniel had been formally terminated pending the outcome of the review, with cause. Misuse of company funds, ethical violations, breach of trust. The words looked sterile on the screen, but I knew what they meant. Careers didn't recover from phrases like that. Not quietly, not ever. I closed the email and sat back, staring at the wall until the house settled around me. Noah was at school. The quiet felt earned. Over the next few days, more confirmations followed. Bank accounts temporarily restricted, credit cards flagged. The lawyer called to walk me through next steps, her tone calm, efficient. This was the part people imagined when they thought of revenge, numbers shifting, access denied. But it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like gravity, consequences obeying their own laws. Daniel tried to contact me through every channel he still had. Emails that began apologetic and ended accusatory. Messages that oscillated between remorse and entitlement. He even sent a handwritten letter, the ink heavy and urgent, as if writing by hand might make his words matter more. I didn't read it. Instead, I focused on Noah, on routine, on dinners and homework, and the steady rhythm of a life that refused to revolve around betrayal. Children noticed everything, even when you tried to shield them. I answered his questions honestly but gently, careful not to turn truth into a weapon. "Are you and Dad okay?" he asked one night, pushing peas around his plate. "We're figuring things out," I said, "and we both love you." That part was still true. Love didn't vanish just because trust did. It just changed shape. The first court date arrived quietly, without drama. I sat in the waiting area with my attorney, hands folded, breathing slow. Daniel arrived late, eyes rimmed red, suit ill-fitting now that confidence no longer held it together. He looked at me like I was something familiar he no longer understood. The judge was efficient. No speeches, no moral lessons, just timelines and boundaries and orders that made the future legible again. Temporary arrangements, clear expectations, a path forward that didn't require my participation beyond compliance. As we left the courtroom, Daniel lingered, watching me like he was searching for something. Anger, maybe. Regret. A crack he could slip through. There wasn't one. "I never thought you'd do this," he said softly. I stopped and met his gaze. "That's the problem," I replied. "You never thought about what I might do." Outside, the air felt different. Lighter. Not because the pain was gone, but because it no longer dictated my posture. I stood straighter without realizing it, like my body had been waiting for permission to take up space. Word traveled faster than I expected. Friends reached out, some apologetic, others curious. A few disappeared altogether, uncomfortable with the reminder that stability could be conditional. I let them go. Clarity had a way of editing your life for you. The woman Daniel had brought with him never contacted me. I learned, through channels I didn't ask for, that she'd returned home early and cut ties quickly. Self-preservation was a powerful motivator. I didn't blame her. She was a symptom, not the disease. One evening, after Noah was asleep, I sat on the porch and listened to the quiet, the kind that settles after storms, when even the insects seem to pause. I thought about the version of myself who'd boarded that plane, contained, observant, bracing for impact. She'd survived. More than that, she'd learned something fundamental. Power didn't announce itself. It didn't need witnesses or applause. It lived in preparation, in patience, in the refusal to explain yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. My phone buzzed once, a final message from Daniel forwarded through his attorney. "He's willing to negotiate." I smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. I typed my response and handed the phone back to my lawyer the next morning. "We already are, through the process." That night, I slept deeply, dreamless and complete. The future wasn't fixed yet, but it was mine again. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. Whatever came next would come without lies. Without fear. Without me shrinking to make room for someone else's ambition. I turned off the light and let the quiet hold. I didn't expect closure to arrive quietly, but that's exactly how it came. Not with apologies or grand gestures, but with ordinary days stacking neatly on top of one another until the past no longer reached me in my sleep. Morning routines stabilized, evenings softened. The house stopped feeling like a place I was bracing myself inside. The final paperwork arrived on a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way except for what it represented. I read it once, signed where indicated, and handed it back without ceremony. The terms were fair, clear, designed to prevent future confusion rather than relitigate old wounds. When it was done, it felt less like an ending and more like a release. Daniel faded from my life the way some people do. Gradually, then all at once. Communication filtered through lawyers, then tapered to logistics, then to nothing that required my attention. He adjusted, or he didn't. That part was no longer my responsibility. The strange thing was how quickly the absence stopped echoing. Noah adapted faster than I expected. Children often do when the truth is handled gently. He found his rhythm again, School, friends, laughter returning to the corners of his mouth. One night, as I tucked him in, he wrapped his arms around my neck and whispered, "You're happier." I paused, absorbing the weight of that simple observation. "I am," I said. And I was. Not euphoric. Not untouched by loss. But grounded. Present. No longer performing stability for the sake of appearances. Weeks passed. Then months. Life reassembled itself around choices I'd made deliberately. I reclaimed old interests, pursued new ones, filled my calendar with things that nourished instead of drained me. The quiet confidence that had carried me through the storm became my baseline. Occasionally, I thought back to the flight, the narrow aisle, the quiet understanding between two seats, the moment everything tilted. It amazed me how small decisions, where to sit, when to stay silent, what to document, had redirected the entire course of my life. Power had never announced itself. It had waited for me to recognize it. I learned something else, too. Revenge didn't have to be loud to be complete. It didn't require humiliation or spectacle. Sometimes it looked like restraint, like letting systems do what they were designed to do, like refusing to protect someone from the consequences of their own choices. People ask me how I stayed so calm. I told them the truth. Calm wasn't the absence of pain. It was the result of preparation, of refusing to be rushed into reactions that benefited someone else. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the light shift across the yard. Noah was inside reading. The world felt balanced in a way it hadn't for a long time. Not perfect, honest. If there was a lesson in all of this, it wasn't about betrayal alone. It was about attention, about noticing patterns before they became disasters, about understanding that love without respect is just endurance dressed up as loyalty. I didn't win by taking anything from Daniel. I won by taking myself back. And if you've been listening to this story and felt something tighten in your chest, if parts of it sounded uncomfortably familiar, I want you to know this. You're not imagining it. Your instincts aren't overreactions. They're information. You don't have to confront everything at once. You don't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes the most powerful move is to observe, prepare, and choose yourself without asking for permission. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever trusted your silence more than your anger? What did it change for you? Share your experience in the comments. Your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. And if you want more stories like this, stories about quiet strength, about tables turning without a single scene, stay with us, subscribe to the channel, and make sure you don't miss what comes next. Because sometimes the most satisfying ending isn't watching someone fall. It's watching yourself rise and never look back.